Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. And thank you for joining us today. We've got a wonderful session all about prompt and knowledge engineering from three people who know a lot about the subject. We're going to talk about different approaches and ultimately how to write, or as I like to say, build better prompts to drive towards contextual relevance and get you to the answers and information you want. Today's speakers, let you gentlemen introduce yourselves. Seth, would you like to start off?
Oh, sure. So if you don't know who I am, I'm Seth Earley. I'm founder and CEO of Earley Information Science. I've been in this space for over 25 years, and you can see I wrote a book called The AI-Powered Enterprise. I'll also give you an opportunity to get an article that I wrote recently about generative AI and knowledge management. I'll leave it at that for now. I have plenty to say in a few minutes.
Sanjay?
Yeah, thanks, Seth. Sanjay Mehta, and I am a principal solution architect. And my background is more around the search and e-commerce landscape. I've worked with a lot of the major vendors over the last 20 years, and more recently at LucidWorks, where we were doing we were one of the leaders, kind of employing a lot of the generative AI solutions and piloting a lot of these solutions in the market. And now, working again with Seth here on a lot of innovations here that we're bringing to the market.
Thank
And
you,
we've known each
Sanjay.
other for 20 or so years, I think.
Yeah.
Long time.
And Nick?
Hi, I'm the newcomer. I haven't known Seth for 20 years, more like 20 days. So my background is in, basically, I've been a copywriter for the last 45 years. I've been a creative director at agencies. I was an early adopter of Web 1, building websites in the mid-1990s. And more recently, I've been teaching the combination of artificial intelligence with emotional intelligence. So that's a bit of a mashup, and I think a very important one for us as we move forward.
Great, thank you. Before we get into the webinar itself, just a few housekeeping notes. We are recording today's session. The recording will be available along with the slides after the webinar. We plan to be about 50 minutes here. Want to leave a couple of minutes at the end for Q&A. And we actually don't have polls today, but certainly as you have questions, put them in the Q&A, and we will be sure to address as many in real time as we can. And in those we can't, we will certainly follow up after the webinar.
And we want to thank our sponsor, CMS Wire.
Yes. In case you don't know anything about Earley Information Science, we are a consulting professional services company. We've been in the business of organizing information and data and solving some of the trickiest information management problems out there. Have been working with clients for 30 years, helping them to sell more products, serve customers more efficiently, of course, accelerate learning internally and innovate faster. Our work has spanned multiple industries, including retail, manufacturing, distribution, life sciences, and financial services. And if you haven't, please check out our website, www.earley.com, to find out more about us.
Okay, so why don't I get started? I think when we think about prompts are providing context, right? We have our LLM, and we're trying to get the best answer from the LLM. And the way to do that is by giving it enough information in the prompt that we are getting to the right place in the knowledge representation. For those of you who don't know how LLMs work, they work with a mathematical representation of content. And essentially, there's a vector representation of all of the information. The large language models work in vector spaces, meaning it's a mathematical representation of the content that has multiple dimensions. And it's hard to think in more than 3 dimensions. But if you use the analogy, and I think this came from you, Sanjay, so I'll steal your thunder on this. If you think of a GPS, it'll get you someplace in 3-dimensional space, right? You can give it a coordinate. But if you start to add other requirements, such as, well, I want a restaurant in this particular geographic area, that's another dimension, right? The GPS will get you there as long as there's a restaurant. Then if you start adding other requirements, such as, well, I want it to be Italian food, That's another dimension. I want it to be moderately priced. That's another dimension. I want it to be to have good reviews. That's another dimension. So each of these are pieces of metadata, but they add more dimensions to the query. And when you look at these vector spaces, they're n-dimensional, meaning there can be thousands of dimensions. So essentially, what we're trying to do with context is navigate in that vector space to get closer to the answer that we need. And this is where providing examples provides context. There, the windows in which we can provide. So in other words, provide some piece of information with the prompt that will tell the LLM, well, I want something like this, or here's the background information. You're contextualizing the prompt. But of course, there's limitations, right? There's limitations in terms of being able to protect your IP. There's also limitations to those context windows and so on. So we'll talk about ways of overcoming some of that stuff. And again, additional related data sources. So we can take in web pages or spec sheets. We just did a project for an industrial manufacturer where we used the LLM to improve data, but all the context was provided by ingesting a lot of other data sources. We're going to show you how we did that. And again, if you think about the user, well, who is that user? Well, is there an avatar or representation or persona of who they are? Is there something that can represent the brand and the brand guidelines and style guides? Are there other things around voice of the customer, around their emotion that will improve our results? All of those things are additional context. And really, we can get context from the large language, where we can provide context and get an answer from the large language model itself, or we can use that to get to a space where we understand that user intent, and then we can retrieve information from a corporate data source. But again, it's still about trying to get to that correct place in that vector space in order to provide to get the best results. And that's what context is. It's trying to give the LLM different ways of doing this. I'm going to let Sanjay talk a little bit about this by task, by model, by mode, and by action. There's different approaches to prompts or by capability. Do you want to go ahead and speak to this, Sanjay, a bit?
Yeah, I think a lot of end users are probably familiar with, one particular mode, more around the sort of chat mode. And when we get more into employing these models and other use cases, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, right? And so that is really to consider how you instruct the engine or the model, right, based on what you want it to do is important, and that can vary. And a lot of them are already built in to handle they understand that request, for example, to summarize or to translate, and more we're getting into having actions here on the bottom where we wanted to call a tool, for example, or write code is another scenario, right, where we're instructing it. So I think that's a kind of important. And then some of these some of you may be using, and some models do support multimodal type scenarios where they're not just processing text input, but maybe images, right, or voice. So to consider how you vary your prompt by that is, I think, very important. And of course, by model, if you're going outside of some of the more well-known models, or some nuances to explore. For example, if you're using Hugging Face or those the model like marketplaces, I guess I would call it, that would be something to consider. And then the other is, assistance. There's a lot of capability coming out from that if you contrast that versus a chat bot. And I always look at it as like a chat is stateless. If you even use OpenAI, you're actually sending all the memory back, all the chat history, and then the older history becomes less important or less weighted, right, to the more recent history. And that works for some use cases, of course, in like a conversational application. But when we think about something in bulk, like we were talking about this product enrichment or improvement task, then something like an assistant approach where you send it standing instructions basically, and then we'll get into more of the dynamic aspect of sending dynamic elements for large tasks like that, or repetitive or in batch, is where we take a different type of approach. And so that's a little bit of some of the kind of background on how to sort of employ different approaches here.
And so this was, again, these were some of your other points here. And I think you might have explained some of this, but why don't you go ahead and kind of walk through these other bullets, if you would.
Yeah, and so, but I mean, we already, for those using it, are sending some form of context in the form of your ask, and these models do extract some of that context automatically, right, from their language understanding or query understanding. But then we think about more advanced examples where you're sending it, you wanted to query a document or query a set of documents. Then we're moving into how we're like a RAG or retrieval augmented approach, right? Or using other retrieval mechanisms to provide that context back to the model. So that's obviously one approach that's been, I think, pretty heavily utilized now over the last year or so, what we've seen. And the others, of course, giving it examples, right? Or even we'll get into a little bit more of a sequence or steps to solve the chain of thought, we call it. But those are different types of ways that we would send context. And think, again, when you think about large scale approaches and using retrievers, for example, invoking another search platform or another retrieval platform like a vector database or a graph database to provide context, that's things to think about and make a lot more powerful use of the platforms here. And then modular, we do suggest breaking down a lot of complex tasks into multiple prompts, if you will, or chain of prompts. LangChain's, of course, a very well-known framework that supports this type of multi modular prompt types approaches. But also, if you're using multiple models or you're using multiple tasks, like most common one we see sometimes is using a model to process vision and then send what was extracted from the process of images, for example, to text. So that's one scenario. And then there's more dynamic prompts or prompt templates, and going back to more like a bulk or an iterative type of task where you have elements of your prompt being populated with variables, right? Like for those of you who come from more full stack development, right, where we create more UX variables and those get populated based on a user, for example, their profile. It's the same concept, and we're just doing that here in the form of prompts. And then finally, like getting into more the chain of thought we were talking about earlier, right? Providing examples, and those examples could even be dynamic, right? I think that's something interesting based on who's interacting with the system as that context changes. But more of those examples improve your performance, right? It could be positive, negative examples, or a chain of thought type of examples, right, to solve a problem. And then let's not forget about how these models can output, right? Some of them have flags for JSON output, or invoking a tool to output into an API and push to another system. Again, output formats are something to consider too, and having those even be potentially dynamic based on your use case and adding additional logic. One thing we definitely do suggest always is adding the reasoning, at least in the beginning, for your diagnosis and troubleshooting or debugging, if you will, to make sure that it's behaving the way you want it. And then let's not forget, these platforms are great at building prompts themselves, right? Ask the model to help you, and again, what's in your prompt to have it build a prompt, right? Those sorts of things. And I know Nick's going to get a little bit more into that. That's his area. But just to throw that out there as well.
Yeah, no, those are great points. And I think what is interesting is we'll get into, there was a quick question about chain of thought. We're going to show an example of chain of thought shortly. But I think the point here is that there are many, many different approaches, and those approaches vary depending upon multiple elements. And again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get the large language model to bring us to the right place in vector space, right? So that it understands the nuances of what we're requesting from it. And then it'll look for something nearby in its vector space to help provide the answer. But again, there's a bunch of different ways of doing that. But these are all ways of trying to get it to contextualize the vector space. That's really what it's coming down to. right? So Nick, I think you were going to talk a little bit about structured prompting.
Sure. Structured prompting makes it sound kind of fancy, but it's actually wonderfully simple, which I appreciate. And to Sanjay's last point about using these models to actually write prompts themselves, I just yesterday, I used GPT-4 to write a prompt for me because I'm not alone. I'm sure I'm not alone, but sometimes I press send on an email and then I read it later and I thought, I wonder if they get the wrong impression. I wonder if I'm coming over as complaining or impatient or something like that. But I've pressed the send and it's too late. So I asked GPT-4 to write me a prompt that I could use to filter my emails before I send them. And it did, and it's a really interesting prompt. And so I've started not every email, but emails where I think someone might misread it. I say, well, I'm just going to check that. I'm going to run it through. So thank you, GPT-4. On structured prompting here, there are lots of.
Can you give us an example of what some of that prompt was? Like what was
It said watch out for signs of impatience, frustration, passive aggression.
Oh, nice.
And ensure that the overriding impression is more positive. And I don't remember the exact thing, but it was looking for negatives and it was also looking to reinforce positives.
Right. So that was part of so you asked it for the prompt to do a certain task and it produced that prompt that you can then inject into your query along with your content. So that's great.
So and so it's a productivity booster, but it also gets me out of hot water sometimes because it's maybe once a month I send an email and I thought, oh man, I wish I'd reread that before I sent it.
I always say that.
So structured prompting. So there's a framework here called RACE, and there's another version called RACE with an F on the end, which we'll get to. And this is basically when people start out with prompting, very often it's just a simple, 10, 15 word prompt, and then you click the little arrow or whatever, and you expect miracles, and sometimes the output's decent, but often not. So this is almost like a first step from casual conversational chat style prompting, just open-ended prompting, to something a bit more, a bit more of a framework that is repeatable and avoids errors and maximizes the kind of benefits. So role at the beginning. So this is where you tell the LLM, this is your role. You are an expert in X. In this case, you're an expert on the topic of on-farm dairy equipment. That's who you are. And that really helps the model to know who it is speaking as. The action that I wanted to take is please write a series of informational emails for prospects for our equipment. The context, this is like a huge dump that we throw in a huge amount of information. So here's all the information, background information about our equipment, about our customers. Here are, you can throw in the company style guide in there. And the context windows are getting so large. I think now with Google's Gemini 1.5, I believe, maybe Sanjay can correct me. I think it's over 1 million tokens you can now put into the context window. So you can put a huge amount of background information there. And for a human, it becomes like impossible. There's so much to kind of wrap your head around. For these models, this is just heaven for them. It's really, really simple for them to crunch through that information. So that's the context. Then examples, and this is something that a lot of people don't do, but it's very, very powerful, is I would put in, like, follow the structure, style, and voice of these previous successful informational emails. So I'm going to show them what's worked really well in the past. And I might put in some negative examples, and here are 5 examples of emails that really didn't perform well at all. So you're giving it this context and examples. In a sense, it's almost the same thing. The F I alluded to at the end is format. So if I'm writing the information, and it's just a simple instruction, it could be make sure that each of these emails is between 250 and 400 words. So it's just about the format of the output, what you're looking for. But this is a very simple, natural language kind of framework and instruction. But it really does formalize things, and it really can have a huge impact on the quality of the output you get, particularly if you pay attention to that context and give it lots and lots of data to crunch through.
Great. And so we talk about use cases, and a lot of times the use cases are basically built when we are defining the problems that we're trying to solve. And the use cases will give us a structure for our knowledge architecture, but they'll also give us the ability to, frame our prompts, right? Because we are going to be saying, well, here's who we are, and here's the action that I need, and here's what I'm trying to accomplish. And when we build use cases, we also talk about entities. We talk about the types of content that's necessary. And we'll show you this in just a minute. But the point here is that when you build libraries of use cases, not only are you identifying what success looks like, but you're also allowing for the measurement of a process. So again, use cases are related to the business problem that you're trying to solve, and then the process that is going to enable a particular outcome. Of course, we need to understand what that data looks like. This is our, our metrics structure, right? We call it our metrics layer cake. Data supports a process, supports an outcome, aligns with strategy. But the idea of building out these libraries of use cases are very important because you're going to test against them, right? They will provide additional context for the LLM, but it's also enabling the ability to kind of test in a consistent way so that you can make sure that you're successful. And then if we can assign or align that with a particular metric, all the better. But again, we'll show you an example a little bit later of how that use case kind of can be the container of metadata, or it can be part of the conversation that's going to be leveraging metadata. We'll talk about that shortly. Sanjay, did you want to speak a little bit to the chain of thought prompting?
Yeah, it looks like there was a question around that too, which is perfect. Yeah, so I've a simple example here, and this is from actually a research paper. We put a link on a little more of that context if you'd like to follow that. But essentially, the reasoning ability in these models allow you to give it a sort of a path, right? Like the steps to solve. And this is the more ubiquitous example here, where everything here in this bubble or square here is the prompt, okay? And you notice what changes between the prompts and how they answer finally below, that's the output that you get, it changes, right? So in this case, we're giving the question, right? The Roger has 5 tennis balls, and then how many more, does he have after he gives away a few, and how many are in each can, right? And then again, the reasoning, especially with some of the smaller models, is going to give you potentially an incorrect number, right? Using that without any kind of logic, right? Without any sort of stepwise solution. And the second example here, again, this whole thing is the prompt. You see, we actually changed how, so we actually gave an example of a solution, right? And it's understand now that formula, if you will, right? Or algorithm or formula to calculate. And now that using that, it was able to output a proper answer. Okay, and I think the inverse side is too, we're going back to like, explain your reasoning or explain the steps that you use to get to this response, right? And this gets more into then understanding the validity or the accuracy of response as well. If you think about the other side of how did you get there, right? Like how did you come to this conclusion? So that's, I think, an important one. But this is powerful because these examples can be unique, right? And if this is showing you more of a math example, but think about any other types of scenarios where you have business logic that you want to incorporate in here. And this is particularly right now relevant for larger models like GPT and Gemini and like Mixtral and Llama 2. And again, it's something to think about as well.
Yeah, so I think the interesting takeaway here is we didn't have to tell it to think step by step. We simply provided an example answer that was giving it kind of a stepwise thought process. So that's what changed here. So both the blue box is the input, right? So in the first case, we just said the answer is 11. The second case, we said, started with 5 balls, 2 cans, blah, blah, blah. And then what it did was it was kind of giving an example of how it needed to think about that problem. Sometimes you also can say, give me your reasoning. And as Sanjay was saying, when we're testing things, we ask it for its reasoning, like explain where you got that answer. And that kind of gives us some insights. There is another question about what about the metadata about the databases or data source, and we'll talk about that in a minute. because those can also provide additional clues. But do you want to talk a little bit about dynamic prompts, Sanjay?
Yeah, and then we hit on this a little bit around doing things at scale, right? And I mean, there's simple use cases where you might create a customer service bot, right, or assistant that's incorporating the customer's profile data as shown here, for example, right? And in an email, I know Nick talked a little bit about those sorts of scenarios where we might use as a use case. And this gets more where we were thinking about bulk tasks, even more critical, right? Where we're populating the inputs that we're sending dynamically, right? And so we identify what areas, even going back to the metrics layer cake that Seth showed, right? When we think about entities, could be a dynamic element, right? Like what entities we send, what kind of outcome we want. Could be a dynamic element. Of course, when we think about other contexts, in the case we're showing here below, if we're doing a product enrichment, for example, scenario, there's unique context for each of these products, right? It could be the product unstructured content, like a spec sheet. Those all are elements that are unique to each of these items that we're working with, and so having that type of template and populating that template as we iterate through these requests is really the only way you can do that at scale, right? And so that's kind of the main purpose of this.
Yeah, it's providing variables in the prompt and then populating those variables, potentially even from output from another prompt, right? From the LM itself. So you can do things in a very stepwise and programmatic fashion, and then scale this again for repeatable tasks or bulk tasks and those use cases that we have a structure for. And again, we're giving it a prompt, and then we're taking the results of that prompt, and we can further act on that using a prompt template. I'm going to show you an example of that a little bit later with all the different sources of context. But let's talk a little bit about collaborative prompting. Nick, did you want to provide some background on this?
Sure. So this is a little different. So remember, I'm from a marketing messaging background. So I'm not into analytics or kind of data engineering or anything like that. I'm much more into communication and messaging. Although we happily draw from data to get things right. Collaborative prompting is really about changing your mindset. A lot of the time we talk about templates and frameworks and structure and things like that, but there's a very different way that you can use these models, which shows some amazing kind of capabilities that you might not stumble across if you're too structured with your input. So I will use this I will have a conversation. I will treat a model, I'll anthropomorphize it to a degree, and decide I'm going to collaborate with AI as a partner, as if she was sitting at my desk. So I'll actually ask the model for its opinion or to contribute to the conversation. So I got one example here. Let's say I'm going through a process. I'm writing something longer form. I'm writing a white paper. I'm writing a report. And I might actually just type in exactly this. Based on our conversation so far, do you think we're missing anything important? If so, what? All right. So this is not, this is conversational. This is collaborative. Mm-hmm. And the outputs I get on this, particularly not at the very beginning of the conversation, but like after a while, can be absolutely amazing. And stuff, I've looked at stuff and I thought, oh my goodness, I would never have thought of that. Seriously, I would never have thought of that without asking this question and receiving that answer, which is extraordinary, because we often think in terms of these models, like, it's math, it's algorithms, it's science and stuff, but there is this weird, and the developers of all of these models will all say that they don't fully understand how these things work or where some of these capabilities come from. Another example of collaborative is I might ask, based on this context, give me 10 topics our audience might be super interested in. And I'll get 10 topics, and then I'll come back and say, okay, give me 10 more, but non-obvious, non-obvious, not the kind of stuff everyone else is talking about, but different stuff. So again, it's an open-ended question. I'm not giving it any extra additional information. And it's out of that non-obvious list that I would usually pick 2 or 3 topics and think, now that's interesting. And again, with the collaborative prompting, what I'm looking for is insights and information that I would otherwise not have thought of on my own. And that I think is a superpower of these models. But you have to
Mm.
kind of put aside the framework approach for a minute and say, okay, I'm going to spend 10 minutes just collaborating and see what can come out of this.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I've also noticed similar things. I use the large language models as a research tool. I don't use them as a writing tool as much. Sometimes I'll ask for an edit or sometimes I'll ask for something, but I really have a hard time with just using having it do my homework for me. So I'm a writer at heart, and actually I think I've kind of slowed down a little bit in terms of my writing because I almost feel like the large language models have added to my a need to process more information, right? So it gives me more possibilities,
Yes.
and there's so much more that I want to include. But this is a great approach in terms of thinking about that. So this is an example you talked about, and I'll show you my results because I tested this out. But why don't you talk a little bit about the empathy or the empathetic prompting? I didn't grab any of your slides from your other deck, but that was very informative. But why don't you talk a little bit about that?
All right. So this is like, comes from a kind of pre-artificial intelligence framework called, basically, a process called empathy mapping. And as a marketer, I have to understand the emotions of my prospect or my customer. We like to think we're rational buyers, but we're not. We're emotional buyers. Emotion is what drives these decisions. So empathy mapping is about really truly understanding the emotions of a prospect or a buyer at a much deeper level than just pure demographic psychographics. So what you want to do with empathy mapping is find out what this prospect says, thinks, does, and feels, because these won't all be the same. All right. So when you do that, and how do you get there? You do it. The best way to do it is through interviews. You interview buyers at different points in the kind of in their purchase journey, and you interview them and say, hey, and you're looking for what do they say, but what are actually they thinking, and what do they do, and what do they feel about it, and you can do that, like I say, through interviews. You can do it through through my brain's gone blank. Anyway, let me move on to the last bit. An example of this would be, I might find out from that the writing, if sorry, my brain's gone. So I might prompt an AI model to write an email to a prospect who says she's excited, but she feels anxious. So that is, there's not a conflict, but there's a complexity there that we wouldn't have got from just psychographics. And so we're digging deeper, going through this process of say, think, does, and feel to get this deeper level. So once I've got that, I will then create an avatar of my buyer based on this empathy map. And you don't usually just have one kind of buyer. So I might actually end up with 3 or 4 different buyer avatars based on the empathy map. That information I will then put into that race framework. All right, I'll put it into there as part of the context. So here's part of the context: is this is what I've discovered about these people based on what they say, think, do, and feel. So it just adds a complexity to, well, complexity is perhaps the wrong word. It adds tremendous depth to your understanding of the emotional state of a prospect or buyer, and then allows you to input that into your prompts and then get much better informed outputs if you are writing or promoting to that audience.
That's great, and I'll just show you an example. But meanwhile, I wanted to call out a question. I see, Sanjay, you're responding to this, but Richard Miller is asking. This is focused on how we can use prompts to get better results. What about instructions that would wrap prompts that a customer might type in an enterprise use case? Is there a different recommendation, or be the same for the prompts? Sanjay, do you want to just speak to that answer? You can type it out, but I think you can also share it with a broader audience.
Yeah, you can do it. Yeah. So yeah, there's definitely nuances going back to like the use case that is employed, and for enterprise, if you're thinking about number one, what type of data are we working with, right? It could be data that has not been the model hasn't been trained on, right? Which then makes you sort of approach the prompt a little differently, right? That's where you're gonna have something more of a RAG model where we're incorporating enterprise documents into the equation. But also the use cases may definitely change when we go internally. Some of them might be analytic prompts. I think that's a common one we're seeing with like conversational analytics, where you're querying analytic data, right, and having the system generate results or create graphs and charts. That would be kind of a very common one. And then, of course, like employee-related types of requests, right? If you think about HR types of related prompts, and there's sort of different areas of the business where the prompt structure could be more constrained, if you will, right? Based on the task you want. You're creating like an HR assistant, you might do something unique there. So, I mean, that's just a few sort of thoughts on that one.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to providing examples and training your employees, but certainly you can train call center or support people or sales engineers and those types of people because it's part of their job, but also getting customers in the habit of writing a better, if it's an external customer that you have less control over, is giving them examples, right? Or or even structuring with templates. I think part of it is trying to constrain the use case, and I think giving examples of how to ask questions in a particular domain by just saying to the customer, here's things you can ask, be sure you include your the model number of your device, or include the detail about your error code or whatever it might be, but you're prompting the user to prompt the engine, right, more effectively. So I think it really comes back to those use cases. I do want to follow through on this example that and let us know if you have any follow-on questions for that, Richard. But again, I think it really is going to be mapping out those use cases and then identifying what information is needed here. Now, this is an example of the empathetic prompt. So in the first case, it was write an email to a SaaS prospect who is excited about making a significant change in her company's operations. And the second was write an email to a SaaS prospect who says she's excited but feels anxious about making a significant change in her company's operations. And I actually ran this through 6 of the LLMs. I forget which one this was from, but what you can see is that the subject is very different, and then the bulleted takeaways. So the first case was saying, "Oh, here's case study, here's product brochure, here's a free trial." And in the second case, now again, maybe you want to say your anxieties, but I did give it that prompt. By the way, here's some ways we can reduce the risk, and this is where human curation comes in: personalized onboarding, dedicated customer service success manager, comprehensive training, phased implementation, right? So it took that generic request and it changed it quite significantly. And the rest of the email was different as well. But you can kind of see how injecting that emotion changed the output quite a bit.
And in terms of click-throughs and conversions, that kind of difference can have a huge impact on the effectiveness of your emails.
Yep, absolutely. I know we're getting short on time here, but there's a question about empathy in building RAG systems. I think that is still true, but let's talk about how we would bring in these other standards and corporate user signals and brand guidelines and so on. And this is kind of the model that we used for this this project that I was telling you about. We had the source data that needed to be enriched. We had related artifacts, so web pages, assets, digital assets, product manuals, spec sheets, knowledge base, the target audiences. And again, I think if you added the empathetic pieces to this, any governance, any rules, restrictions, style guides, branding, search rules, examples, right? And then third-party intelligence from, say, the Google Knowledge API and Knowledge Graph, competitor websites, the large language model itself. In this case, it was maintenance, repair, and operations. So we have an MRO knowledge graph that was created for this company. And then, of course, the user context, which includes the digital body language, right? What are they actually doing? Clickstream analysis and search analytics and performance metrics and audience profile. And again, what are they doing real time and near real time? And what we can do is we can bring these documents into a unified repository, and we can generate the document embeddings, right? So this is pulling all these pieces together and then bringing this into a vector space. And then the same thing happens with these other sources, right? This is, again, using modular RAG because you're processing these data sources slightly differently. It's like the old days of search pipeline processing, right? Where we could have one module that would do text normalization, another that would do entity extraction, another to do sentiment analysis, and so on. We're doing the same thing, but we're using these all to create embeddings and to create representations in vector space, right? So all of this stuff provides the ultimate context with metadata with all of these sources. And what this allows us to do is it allows us to bring in all those other sources so that we can run our data enrichment and ask the system to generate new product names, new descriptions, new keywords, new schemas, new attributes, right? These are all the things that we're adding, but we're doing this by bringing all these other contextual sources together. That is really critical. And that's something that not a lot of organizations are doing in terms of the vendors that are out there. And of course, you need to align this with our knowledge architecture. And this is what we talked about before. You know, how do I set up? I changed this I meant to change this to router. But the point here is that if we ask these questions, we need reference content, and we also need that content to be tagged with metadata, right? Because otherwise, that piece of content we need is going to be lost, right? We need to understand this. So I need to install a router. Well, the first thing a human might ask, or a system, well, what router model do you have? 2960. Okay, I can start pulling in here the installation settings. And I'm pulling this from componentized content, right? So this is what we need for customer support. I'm getting an error code of 50. Here are the troubleshooting steps, right? So what I'm doing is I'm giving it back, giving the user back these modular components which contain that very specific knowledge and information, but it requires the context, the type of information, the installation, the product model, the error code. So again, here are the different metadata fields that we have when we're doing this. And what we can do is we can also have the prompt as the metadata container. I need to install a model 2960 router. I'm receiving an error code of 50. Please provide the troubleshooting steps. That gives it all of the context that it needs. So when you think about it, you know, this is where you, again, can train your internal users, but you can also start providing examples for your customers to follow. And then when we start looking at knowledge graphs, well, knowledge graphs are really the source of the content relationships and context, including data relationships. So they can be a source of truth for the large language model because we have the ability to pull in information using a RAG approach that is specific to our use case. And here's a derived knowledge graph. Sanjay, do you want to share your screen? I can stop sharing for a minute and maybe you can walk through some of this.
Sorry, it's going to be a little bit of an eye chart, probably for a lot of folks. But
you can zoom in here and there just to show the detail.
You know, here is where we've built a graph on a catalog of actually not that many items, but a couple thousand items. But to give you the idea, you know, you see this kind of overall universe of items and relationships, and we kind of scroll in and see how things are clustering together. Let me just start focusing in, and so you know, we have I guess what we'd call nodes that are orphans, right, which may not necessarily be associated, or they're their own sort of items. And this is kind of nice for diagnosis of understanding where things are outliers or anomalies. And here just as an example, like of a product that might be missing some associations, but you can see one powerful thing is extracting the meaning or ontology of these items, like what it is, you know, who makes it, it has what features. This is particularly important for B2B, right? And understanding, specific features that might be attached. But if we go back,
And those were not in the record. Those were not in the individual record.
right,
These were
especially
derived.
right, the ontology was not there. And that's critical because a lot of applications would use ontology if you think about like search or analytics or personalization or other enterprise use cases. And then here you've got like a larger like map of all this sort of properties that might occur, right? Like what it has, what does it include? What other features there might be. So you kind of like a universe of features. And then again, linking all these sorts of things across the board, I think is what's the compelling piece. And this is more what we call a property graph. And when we think about passing some of this, this is something that the LLM generated, which is very powerful, right? Using embeddings, generating embeddings and extracting these types of relationships out or properties out. And again, you could use this on your own internal data to pass back in your context, right? What type of relationships or what kind of ontology we should be sending in each request, for example. Like we care about these properties, we care about these features or these dimensions, and depending on the use case, we would navigate this accordingly. And I know it's hard to little visualize this whole thing, but that's what we just wanted to convey here was
Yeah.
our
And what's so interesting, thank you, Sanjay. And what's so interesting about this is the fact that you can now establish product relationships, like whole part relationships. You can have accessories, you can have kits, you can have, complete solutions. And that's been a very difficult thing for organizations to get their minds around or get their operations around, is providing these part relationships. And there's several different types of part-to-part relationships that you can use in cross-selling and upselling and solutioning and so on. And so this is actually very, very powerful, but it also shows where the gaps are. It shows where you need to kind of connect things into the complete product catalog. But again, a really great example of how we can derive this from the data sources. Anything else to add to that, Sanjay?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a line. I know with a lot of time, we could spend a whole session just on this, actually.
Yeah. And there is that whole thing around the results of this product data improvement, which we can certainly talk about. Again, we've already talked a little bit about this, but this was asking the LLM, what should I ask about generative AI and prompts, right? So it's very meta. And the prompts, it's the prompt's purpose. What's the goal? What are you trying to do? What kinds of, writing different creative content? Who's the target audience? What's the context of the output? Is it marketing? Is it educational? Is it entertainment? And then the creating, what specific information or keywords must be included, and then phrasing the prompt for clarity. And what this does, this is like the use case. This follows the output. What is the isness and aboutness of the content, right? What's the technical depth? These are all characteristics. How do you describe the audience? What is the expected artifact, right? What's the content type that you're expecting? So all of this, what additional metadata can you provide? So all of this is really asking for additional metadata in order to be able to create the prompt most effectively. That is essentially why the use case is tied to the knowledge architecture. So again, it's developing use cases for iterative testing. It's creating prompts that represent those different classes of use case so that you can do them from a template perspective, providing cheat sheets, training materials, examples for how users should ask questions, making sure that it's aligned with the knowledge architecture so we can kind of understand what I need to ask in order to retrieve this content. And again, a lot of the problems with LLMs on the retrieval side is the same problem we've always had with retrieval, which is the content isn't there, it's not well structured, it's not well organized. So there's a lot of new tools in modular RAG, right? We didn't really talk about modular RAG, or we mentioned it, but a lot of tools that will enable the ingestion of these different data sources to provide overall context for enrichment, or for your answer, your solution, getting to exactly that right information for that particular user. So we want to make sure we identify the problem that's important to the organization. Obviously, it has to be something that is going to get funding because it is a powerful use case, and get that executive support. We need to define those scenarios, those use cases. We need to understand the content and the data that's needed to support that. We want to have baseline metrics for whatever process we're doing so we can show an improvement. And then, of course, we have to start building the structures, building the domain model, building the metadata structures for those target use cases, and ingesting content into the vector store as enriched embeddings. And you kind of saw that in that big diagram where I showed all those different data sources. In many cases, that was ingesting content that was organized using the various taxonomies and ontologies, and then testing it right against those gold standard responses. Like, here's when we did this for a life sciences company recently, we had 60 use cases and we knew what the answers were, and then we could show how accurate those were. And of course, if you have those baselines and you're instrumenting this correctly, we can show the improvement in that particular target process. And then, of course, it's shampoo, rinse, repeat across various processes. Now, we do have a KM readiness assessment, and this is kind of like, I'm sorry, an AI, KM and AI. Let's see, I was just looking at another question here. What software are we using to visualize the relationship graph, Sanjay?
Yeah, I use the Python open source library. I'm pulling up my code right now to get which one I try to figure out.
Deriving ontology from data. Are you planning on passing that on all that ontology in each prompt? So Sanjay, not exactly, right? We're using that to build the vector representation, but we're not actually passing that with the prompt, correct?
Well, we do, yeah. In many cases we use that to when we think about a dynamic prompt template. Some of that ontology that we have realized for a given like document or item or catalog, like a set of items, would be incorporated, and that kind of helps form also what we want back, like even what we want to ask, right? Or, you know. And so that's like properties that we want back, and even the priority of those properties. So absolutely, it would be a common use case.
Okay, so we are using the full knowledge graph, or we're using portions of that knowledge graph?
I mean, we navigate, like that's where that's actually used embeddings to build that graph. So it's a lot of it, like where like you were mentioning how we navigate around this graph.
Right. So we're not passing it with a prompt, but we're using it in the vector space.
Right, exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. Dave, did you want to talk a little bit about our readiness work that we've done for organizations? It could be AI readiness in general. It could be KM for AI. You want to
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we've worked with clients over the past couple of years to really try to hone in on specific problem and opportunity areas and think through, again, a use case driven approach. You know, when a company has a large appetite for launching AI across different departments at scale, we generally say, let's start with a few use cases where there's a set of, you know, known opportunities or challenges, and also engage stakeholders, so people who can commit and dedicate some time to getting work organized quickly and developing a proof of value plan. And the proof of value plan is actually prototyping and implementing applications and getting real measurements and feedback on those applications, so you can see what's working and understand, is this worth scaling and future investment, or is this something that we need to pivot and rethink? We generally try to do these in 2 to 3 weeks, and it really gives teams, you know, whether it's a marketing team, an operations team, a sales team, a blueprint and a couple of actionable areas where they can start really not only playing with generative AI and other current AI approaches, but embedding them into their daily activities.
Part of what we do is we do a maturity model. Some people like maturity models, some people don't. It's just basically saying, where are you today and where do you need to be? Because again, knowledge is critical to this, data is critical to this. We have lots of maturity models. And then we have working session topics that you can take a look at. But, you know, these are the this is the structure for our workshop. And again, it's really to help you kind of go from where you are today to where you need to be, and, you know, understand those use cases, get everybody on the same page. What are the capabilities? What are the limitations? What are the success factors? You know, what are the areas in which we need to be ready? You know, do we have clarity? Are we looking at the right processes? Or do we have the data? What are our ongoing governance and decision-making processes? And then again, setting all of this up in a proof of value based on your corporate knowledge. This is just one of the articles I mentioned, what executives need to know about knowledge management, large language models, and generative AI. And that's the URL to go ahead and download that if you'd like. Also, Nick does offer some training courses into some of these areas. So I want to give a plug to Nick and his website. So that's bemorehuman.ai. And again, that's the rest of our stuff. So, whoops, I don't know how I got out of presentation mode. But anyway, thank you all for your time. If there's any other questions, you can certainly send them out to us. I'm glad folks have enjoyed this. And I'll just leave our contact information up here. And again, Nick, Sanjay, thank you so much for your time today. And thank you, Dave, for getting us started and finishing things up. And of course, thank you to everyone who has listened today. Feel free to pass this on to your colleagues, and we'll get the recording out to you and the slides, and reach out if you'd like to have us come in and help you in these areas. So thanks, everyone.